When it comes to Final Fantasy, not everything can be sugar and rainbows. And even being a big fan of the Final Fantasy franchise, I do have my breaking points that I'm like, to the point, okay, you know what? I have to say that these games are the least enjoyable in the series. By no means are these bad games. There are elements in each Final Fantasy that I do believe has a purpose. But these 4 titles, there's one I'm not going to say that about, and we'll get into that one at the very last. But these 4 titles that I have chosen, while they have redeeming qualities, they just lack in a lot of certain departments that didn't capture the same feel that a lot of the other Final Fantasy games had. So let's hop into this list with Final Fantasy III for the Nintendo DS. It was actually originally an NES port, and this is a full-fledged remake. Final Fantasy III on the Nintendo DS would be the first time that America ever got an actual translation of the original Final Fantasy III. This would be the first time that Japan would bring it over, or Square Enix would bring it over, translated by them for the American audience. It did make some significant changes to the title, such as adding some names to the characters, the main characters, rather than having them just blindly named characters running around. But other than that, its story was pretty forgettable. Its story really didn't do anything for me. I remember a few things here and there, namely the Cloud of Darkness, namely the guy who put the world into darkness. I remember leaving the floating continent and finding out that there was a world down below. I remember going into a mansion full of gold. I remember coming across the Uni's mirror and Dogma's artifacts in the game. And that's pretty much it. Final Fantasy III, though the time I did have with it, I did find it semi-enjoyable. It was just overall an experience to me that was forgettable. And it's one that's just going to sit on my shelf and collect dust and just be part of my Final Fantasy collection. But Final Fantasy III for me was not the best game in the series. Revenant Wings, or Final Fantasy XII Revenant Wings. Final Fantasy XII Revenant Wings was the sequel to Final Fantasy XII. And I will say, this game's redeeming quality that makes it such a fun title to play, and a recommendation for those looking for a story that can get past the gameplay mechanics, which we'll get into here in just a minute. This game has a beautiful story that just coincides and goes along magnificently with Final Fantasy XII. We are put back in the role of Vaughn as him and his friends get their hands on an airship and launch off to a floating continent up in the sky. And this floating continent, they meet this race called the Lemuria, or the Aegil. Yeah, it's I think the Aegil, something like that. But they're winged creatures that fly around. And long story short, the game focuses around more control from the Valkyria, and it's just a beautifully well done, semi-emotional story that I respected this game more for a story than anything. That is honestly why I pushed through this game to get to the end, was to see how its story played out. Now, let's talk about its gameplay. Its gameplay is where it faltered the most. It is what I would consider an above-average strategy game, or RTS game, and it really doesn't do anything too great with the strategy. You summon monsters, each monster has different abilities, and it becomes more of a nuisance there. What's really frustrating about this game is it has a pretty easy time getting up to about Chapter 8. Once you hit Chapter 8, the game takes a difficult learning curve, and it throws you into some really hard fights. It took me 2.5 years to beat this game because of all the frustration that those boss fights had put me in. I was finally able to finish this title and add it to my list of completed Final Fantasy games, but not at the cost of the enjoyment. While I said the story was good, this is just a game I'm not going to return to. Even doing some of the side quests that explain more in the story, I just don't want to be bothered because the gameplay was not that great. But if you're into RTSs, you find them a little bit easier. You may come across this game and find it a bit easier for me, but RTSs and me just do not get along. It's not that I don't like them, it's just I struggle to pull ahead in them. I was never able to really beat Warcraft 3 without any cheats, so there is that to contend. But Final Fantasy XII, Revenant Wings, it's worth a pickup if you can get past the RTS combat. Next entry up on this list is Final Fantasy II, the last numbered installment that's going to be in this countdown. Now, Final Fantasy II is a bit of hit and miss for me, because while I think its story elements are very intense, there's a lot going on in its story that I feel adds depth to a lot of the characters. It's emotionally impact. You're watching yet again as an empire tries to take over the world and how they pretty much don't give a rat's ass who they slaughter. It falls short in its gameplay mechanics. Final Fantasy II, though the concept of it sounded amazing at the time, where this game completely falls flat and misses the point is in its leveling up system. So basically, in order to level up in this game, you have to use certain weapons. That's not really the annoying part, but once you use a certain weapon, your character will start to gain more skills in there. So if you equip them with two-handed swords, they're going to learn to do they're going to do more damage that way. If you use magic, they're going to gain MP, gain magic that way. Where this game really takes a nosedive in its leveling up system is in order to actually up your HP or increase your defense, you need to sit there and take a beating. And it's just an annoying way to grind your characters. The concept was great, but when you have a game that is solely focused on getting the upper hand of your enemies, and the only way to level that up is to needlessly grind and getting the shit beat out of you so you can level up your characters, it becomes a bit annoying. There are ways that you can cheese the grind system, but it's not really fun just sitting there in battle with weak enemies, beating the shit out of each other with your party members to increase their stats. And this is the sole fact why Final Fantasy II does remain on my list of Final Fantasy games that I just have not completed. I have not wanted to sit down and sink the time into cheesing the system just so I can pull ahead, or playing the game the way that it's meant to be and struggling as hardcore as the game requires. There are some redeeming concepts. Like I said, some of the characters are pretty great. Final Fantasy II does have the first few Final Fantasy characters, the party members to actually die. Minwu and Joseph are the two that end up sacrificing themselves. And Joseph's story, actually, fun fact, Joseph's story is told by Ramuh in Final Fantasy IX when Garnet is trying to obtain him at Pinnacle Rock. So, a little fun nod. That story you hear in Final Fantasy IX is from Final Fantasy II. Now, these last two entries, I know I said 4 of them weren't bad games, but I'm actually going to take that back. Both of these titles that I'm going to speak of are absolute pieces of garbage. These are the 2 Final Fantasy games that I cannot recommend to anybody. I will not recommend to anybody. And I will go on record saying that these are the shittiest pieces of garbage that Square Enix has ever created. And shame on them for tarnishing what was 2 great games with these sequels. And I do want to make mention, yes, this is Final Fantasy IV, the complete collection. But Final Fantasy IV is a good game. Final Fantasy IV deserves the praise that it gets. Its story may not have aged the best, but it still holds up as a great game and one I thoroughly enjoyed. Its sequel, on the other hand, Final Fantasy IV The After Years, is an oversaturated piece of dog shit that should have never have been created. Now, let me give you a history of the After Years a little bit so you guys understand kind of where this came to be. The After Years was really one of Square Enix's first attempts to go into episodic content. The After Years was originally released on Nintendo WiiWare as a sequel to Final Fantasy IV, where they would continuously pump out different episodes that you had to pay. I think the final price for it, if I calculated out everything for all the DLC, shit like that, was like $40 for the game, 30, 35, somewhere around there. And I bought this collection with Final Fantasy IV, a damn great game, and an interlude to the plot, which again is relatively short, plus the After Years, the complete collection, for $40. Not only did I get an extra episode, not only did I get a piece of garbage game with all the episodes, but I got a magnificent title accompanied in this right here on my PlayStation 4. I would recommend picking this up if you haven't done, because it is a great way to play Final Fantasy IV. The only drawback to it is they don't have the 3DS graphics, if that's something you're looking for. It does retain the old sprites done up in HD, but does take the cinematics from the DS version and implement them in here. Now, the After Years, the biggest problem that I have with that is not the gameplay. The gameplay actually feels fairly solid. What I have a problem with is how the game is divided up into episodes and throws you into the hands of each character in Final Fantasy IV as they kind of go along and repeat the same events of number 4. Where I ultimately just decided to shelve Final Fantasy IV and really contemplating, even still to this day, if I want to pop this back into my PSP system and finish it out, is once I realized the story was taking the same damn events that the original Final Fantasy IV did. It worked in Final Fantasy IV, but to see Cecil succumb to the same shit that the King of Baron did in the first game, and to see his fall from grace, was absolutely asinine. To think that someone who had overcome so much darkness inside of his heart to become a better person would be so blindly influenced, even after watching his best friend Cain go through the same shit. And to top it all off, they have Cain go into Mount Ordeal, fight his inner demons, like it's supposed to be some emotional story as to him becoming a better person, and it just does not pull off the same effect as Cecil. Final Fantasy IV, the After Years, in no way, shape, or form is a way to tell a story. Final Fantasy IV, the After Years, is a prime example of the way you don't go about doing a sequel for a game, and shame on Square Enix for trying. The After Years is crap, and just stay away from it. And the worst Final Fantasy game of all time is this lovely little piece of garbage right here, Lightning Returns. Popular to contrary belief, Final Fantasy XIII is not as bad as people make it out to be. I feel that there are people out there who legitimately hate it, which is fine, but I feel like 90% of the internet didn't get past a certain part and just jumped on the hate train because it was popular. And what gets me with this game is a lot of people will turn around and tell me, well, Lightning Returns is better than Final Fantasy XIII. No, it's not. This game is garbage. This game is a piece of shit that should have never been made. The fact that they tried to take the game, make it more open world, failed horribly at it, tried to tell a cohesive story setting up 1,000 years after the plot from Final Fantasy III, completely regarding any little bit that we had actually cared about from the characters, wanting to know what was going on in that 1,000 years. Instead, we're given characters who are a shell of their former selves, who are not really who they are, even with their hardships that they're going through, is completely ludicrous and doesn't even add to their character. They feel completely out of place. Lightning doesn't even seem like Lightning anymore. Hope doesn't even seem like Hope at this point anymore. They brought Hope back to a child after the events of Final Fantasy II. Snow is completely unrecognizable. Here you have this melodramatic hero that I actually quite well enjoyed from Final Fantasy XIII turn into a mess of his former self as he gave up hope of pretty much what was going on after Sarah died, which is understandable. But to go through the much turmoil that he did was just absolute bullshit. And the one thing this game does, the two biggest flaws this game does is, one, I was actually hoping that this game would bring closure to Caius' story. The one Final Fantasy villain that I felt I actually connected with in a way for the reason he was doing things. I talked about this in my video about Final Fantasy villains and why I liked Caius. It would have been nice to see Caius' story arc change, but no. They just have a little exchange, a little fight, and Lightning's like, I want to return you to the world. That's how you're going to close out Caius' story. It's complete bullshit at this point, and didn't even deserve any hype that this game got. To say this piece of garbage is better than Final Fantasy XIII, anybody who believes that needs to be slapped across the face, because this game is not better than Final Fantasy XIII. It is a stain on the Final Fantasy name, and if I wasn't a collector and wanted every Final Fantasy game, I would probably burn this copy right here in front of my webcam, take this shit outside, light it on fire, pour gasoline on it, and watch this shit go up in flames. But because it's part of the Final Fantasy franchise, it's going to stay in my collection. And the worst flaw that this game had was incorporating a time mechanic that just did not feel great. And I get what they were trying to do. Majora's Mask has pulled it off very well. It's a game I still need to finish, but from what I was able to play, it handles it very well. The biggest problem is with this, there's no backtracking like there is in there, but you have this ability where you constantly have to keep an eye on the time and pause time to actually do anything. And you get to the point where you can pretty much grind up this magic meter of yours in order to cast what's called chronostasis, which freezes time. But after the umpteenth time of doing it to try to complete the side quest, just like, really? 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 It was already bad enough that Final Fantasy XIII-2 had to come along and undo the events of Final Fantasy XIII. But we were actually expecting some closure. And, spoiler, so if you don't want 13 or Lightning Returns ending spoiled, skip ahead in the video, stop here. But this game actually goes in to explain how Earth was created. Yes, there is a connection now between our world and Final Fantasy, thanks to this hunk of shit. So, that's all I gotta say. Stay away from Final Fantasy XIII, because it is garbage. Or Lightning Returns, because it is garbage. And Final Fantasy XIII deserved a little bit better send-off than this. This is my thoughts and my opinions on this. Be sure to hit subscribe there for me to keep up to date with all of my content. You can follow me on Facebook and Twitter. My other social media links down below in that description box. You guys have been watching the Spoony Bard, and most importantly, stay happy, be happy, game happy. Spoony Bard is checking out.